Well, hello there. Today we're going to be talking about Big Bang cosmology, the anthropic principle, string theory, and the Christian doctrine of creation. Now, often the question is raised, if there is a Big Bang and that is accountable for the beginning of our universe, then does that rule out the existence of God? And I think we could say initially, absolutely not. God can create by means of anything that God wants to. And so God may be the efficient cause, and he may work by means of instrumental causes. Certainly, Christians have always held that God does this at all times in human activity. God accomplishes his will by means of human free agents. This might apply to cosmology as well and to the Big Bang theory. For our discussion today, I'm going to use this little chapter by Dinesh D'Souza from his book, What's So Great About Christianity, because it gives a very simple look at a very complex process, and it leads us right to the issues that we want to consider. Now, D'Souza begins by claiming that Copernicus is dead. And what he means is that the whole series of ideas engendered by the Copernican Revolution in science, which seem, at least initially, to lower the importance of humans' place in the greater cosmos, has been overturned by more recent scientific data. The first step comes with Copernicus himself in observing that the Earth revolves around the sun. Now, already this was a threat to the Catholic Church because not only did the scriptures say the sun rises and the sun sets, but if the Earth is not the center of the universe, then it looks as if we're simply one little part in a much bigger universe. We spin around one star amongst many stars where there may be other planets, there might even be other forms of life, and the importance of human beings seems to be diminished by that observation. A second step in this came in the 1860s when Charles Darwin's work on evolution began to be recognized by others. The claim is that human beings have developed from less complex forms of life, and that those forms of life could be traced all the way back to a particular beginning in history, and that beginning was a long time ago. And so there was development of life through particular species all the way up until our species today. That seemed to make the claim that human beings were not any more special than animals. They're simply the latest in the series of evolutionary progression. A third step here is by modern Big Bang cosmology. We notice that the universe is expanding. We can see the rate of expansion. And through that, the claims have been that the beginning of the universe can be brought back to a point about 14 billion years ago. And that there was an immense amount of time then before human beings even came along on the scene. This seemed also to greatly reduce the importance of human beings in the overall universe because, well, we have arrived very, very late on the scene. Here's an analogy that'll help us to get at the immensity of our universe and the briefness of our life on it. Let's picture a bookshelf filled with 30 large volumes, and each of these volumes has 450 pages. This is a massive book, the kind that you don't want a professor to assign you to read. Every page in every one of these volumes stands for 1,000,000 years then. We move all the way up until volume 22 of this 30-volume set to even get to the first forms of life. About 3.8 billion years ago is when some scientists would calculate that life began. And yet, it's even another 2 volumes before there was the Cambrian explosion, that diversity of life forms that we seem to see replicated in the fossil records. And then, of course, human life forms occupy a very small part of this. In fact, the last couple of lines on the 30th volume. So in our 30 volumes, each 450 pages, and each page representing 1,000,000 years, it is just a couple of lines at the end of the 30th volume that describes the human existence on Earth, and therefore that seems to show the almost utter irrelevance of human beings on Earth. But the conclusion of human irrelevance doesn't need to be drawn. And in fact, new scientific research seems to suggest exactly the opposite, that human beings occupy a very special place in the universe. In fact, the universe seems to be designed in all of its great complexity precisely for human beings. For human beings to exist right now at this particular time and place, a whole series of things had to have happened in our evolutionary past and in our cosmological past that would lead up until this moment here where all of the exact precise elements of nature are set up in such a way that human beings can and do exist. Now we know that nature has been set up that way because, well, we are here. We do exist, and we can see it. This leads then to the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle states that clearly the universe, from its very opening moments, existed in such a way that allowed for the eventual existence of persons endowed with mind. Now that principle itself shouldn't be controversial to anyone because we're here. And so we know that the universe must always, however old it is and however it's been structured, must have been structured in such a way that human beings would be the result, because we're here. So far, there's no controversy, but it's when we begin to look at the details of this claim that things get rather amazing. Let's look at the big picture first. When we examine the size of our universe right now, what we notice is that the universe itself seems to be expanding. And it's balanced by a great number of stars that must exist in their current locations in order to hold the balance of the whole universe in place. We call this the cosmological constant, that observation that we can see matter expanding outward. In that, what we see in our universe is that, according to scientists, there are 10 to the 22nd power number of stars. Now that's a huge number, but we might ask, why not 10 to the 11th number of stars? After all, it would seem like our universe could do that as well. But in fact, it couldn't. If there were 10 to the 11th number of stars, the balancing of gravitational forces wouldn't be right, and the universe would collapse in on itself. All of the stars must be just the number that they are, and they must be moving apart from each other at just the speed that they are for us to be here right now. That's a pretty amazing reality. Or instead, we could look at the small view. We might ask the question, why do atoms have just the ratio of protons and neutrons? Why are each the size that they are within an atom? We recognize that they have to be exactly that ratio and no other in order for atoms to form. Furthermore, in the first few seconds of the Big Bang, cosmologists argue, there must have been a formation of certain elements, helium and lithium, for example, with their atoms with just exactly the right balancing of protons and neutrons within those atoms. And all of this had to take place within the first several hundred seconds. That's the first 3 minutes. If it hadn't, then there could be no star furnaces, and there would be no stars, and there would be no universe as we know it. Or we could ask about those fundamental forces in nature. If there was a change, Stephen Hawking suggests, of just as little as 0.5% in the strength of a strong nuclear force, or maybe even up to 4% in the electric force, this would destroy the possibility of carbon and oxygen atoms being formed. There could then be no star furnaces, and there would be no stars, and there would be no universe. The universe would have collapsed in on itself in the first few seconds. So everything at the smallest level must have gone right in order for us to be here today. 14 billion years ago, things took a very particular course so that we would be here today. If all of that seems rather improbable, I want to add one more factor, and that is the transfer from non-life to life. This has never been seen in a science experiment, of course, but the problem is much bigger than that. What we see is a single-celled organism has to exist in order for life to be able to reproduce. How do we get from non-life to a single-celled organism? A single-celled organism is amazingly complex. It has many different functions and parts operating together in just exactly the right way. Fred Hoyle has suggested that this would take 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power of a chance of moving from non-life to the correspondence of a single-celled organism with all of its parts working right so that it's able to generate life itself. Point is, that seems enormously improbable. And so that's the best scientific evidence that's out there, both in cosmology and then in that one instance I gave in biological evolution. That's the data. What do we do with this data? Well, there's 3 possibilities. The first amounts to chance. It doesn't matter, they would say. This is called the weak anthropic principle. The argument here is, of course, the universe looks intelligently designed because it's intelligent beings who are looking at it. We see that we're here, and so we figure that there must have been intelligence because we're intelligent beings and we're the ones looking at it. The basic point here is we don't need an explanation. It's simply enough to say that we're here. That's it. But most scientists are not really satisfied with that. After all, the high improbability of these things, astronomically improbable, seems to demand a better answer than that. And so we're left with a couple of different answers here. We must go with the strong anthropic principle. This is the scientific term, and that is that the fact that we exist imposes constraints not just on our environment, but on the possible form and content of the laws themselves. Now, what it's getting at is we need some explanation for it. But what explanation? Well, on the one hand, some scientists are suggesting the possibility of mini-universes. A multiverse, it's called. That is, that there may be many different universes exploding like bubbles all the time, coming into existence and going out of existence. They are expanding and they may pop. Ours has been a particularly successful one because it's lasted for a long time. But there may be almost an infinite number of universes. And maybe that's the explanation for why we're here. We are incredibly lucky, of course. But the reason that this happened with us is because there are so many universes out there that we just happen to be the right one. Or maybe there's a different explanation for it. Maybe the explanation that is most fitting is that the universe looks designed because it is. All of these amazing improbabilities have happened exactly the way that they have because God has seen to it that they occur that way. Maybe God has designed this universe in exactly the way that it turned out, specifically because he wants us to be here right now at this time in this place. And maybe that's the most useful explanation. So given all the scientific data that we have, these seem to be our 3 possibilities. Perhaps it's chance. No explanation needed. The universe just is, and we live in it. Or maybe the possibility has occurred because there are many, many universes out there. Ours just happened to be the one with exactly the right balancing of gravitational forces, the right alignment of elements. Or maybe it's because the whole thing was designed by God, and that's the reason that we exist as we do. That, D'Souza says, is the simplest of the arguments. If we're going to apply Occam's razor, when all other things are equal, we use the simplest explanation. He says, design is the simplest explanation. Now, it's precisely here that I have a problem with de Souza's argument. I think it's mistaken. I think it's greatly mistaken. Of course, I agree with de Souza that God is the creator of the world. All Christians will always believe that God is the creator of all things. But why must we choose between a natural explanation and a supernatural explanation? Could it not be that God designs, and he designs by means of natural process that are observable in science? Let's try the following problem. Let's say that Christians woke up tomorrow morning and found out with absolute certainty, no question about it, that there are more than one universe. There are other universes out there, and ours is merely one of many universes. By that recognition, would Christians give up their faith in God? I don't believe so. I'm sure that I would not. In fact, it would encourage my wonder of God. I would be amazed at the greatness that he is. I would be amazed at what he's done in creating not only this universe that I see with such great complexity, but also perhaps other universes. I would still attribute everything that is to the Creator God, and I would still recognize him as the source, support, and end of all things. Why do we need then to pose a conflict between a scientific explanation and a theological explanation? I'm certainly not saying the scientific model is correct. It seems rather far-fetched to me, but if it were correct, that wouldn't do anything against our belief in God. And so we probably should not pit the two against each other as if they were enemies of each other somehow, as if one explanation, the natural explanation, eliminated the need for a supernatural explanation. My caution here is that Christians don't fall into something of a God of the gaps opposition with science. Christians put themselves in a tricky situation when they begin to hold a God of the gaps type of apologetics. That is, because we haven't found a scientific answer, we propose God as the answer. But then when a scientific answer comes along that seems credible, that seems to eliminate the need for God as an explanation. Scientific data and Christian faith affirmations do not exist on the same level. So my caution here is simply, don't get stuck in a God of the gaps, in which you will end up losing credibility if a scientific explanation is sometime applied. Instead, let's not be too quick to accept any scientific model simply because it comes from scientists, as if that makes it authoritative for our lives. But let's think about these scientific models. Let's reason with them. Let's look at the data, and let's allow that to help us worship God in a greater way. After all, what we've seen here today is that our universe is an enormously amazing thing. God must be an enormously amazing God to have created the universe in the way that he did with the structure that it has. And this should expand our worship for him and our desire to know him.